So welcome everyone. Again, welcome those on Zoom and welcome those that are listening back to the recording on the video. You are joining the Compassionate Mental Health webinar this evening, hosted by the Network of Wellbeing and with Andy Bradley as our guest. So this evening we're going to have a really interactive discussion with those of us joining on Zoom, and we hope that you enjoy watching the recording later, if you're watching it later. To start off with, I'd just like to introduce Andy, who's going to be our guest for this evening, delving into this topic. So Andy is the founder of an organisation called Frameworks for Change, and he's really engaged with the topics of compassion and healthcare. He's worked on a range of other projects as well. So he's on the core team for the Compassionate Mental Health gatherings, which we'll mention again towards the end of this webinar. And I know Bridget, who's joining, was the founder of, and so is very actively involved. And he's also the part of the Leeds Festival of Compassion and Wellbeing, which is a very exciting project, which we can again mention at the end. And I know some people on the webinar are involved in and a part of. So that's a little bit about Andy. How this webinar is going to go this evening. The reason that we run these webinars as a series, and we invite different guests to talk about lots of different aspects of wellbeing. And the Network of Wellbeing really sees our personal wellbeing as connected to each other, to how we live in our communities, how we live in society, how we connect with the natural world. So we really want to create that environment where we share from different perspectives and build that kind of understanding, build well-being together so that we can support each other. And this month we really wanted to focus on mental health because it was World Mental Health Day earlier in the month, and a really nice opportunity to shine a light and perhaps kind of investigate the topic of mental health in a very loving and compassionate way, and perhaps a slightly different way than some of us may be used to. And Andy has got so much experience in this area, so it's really, really just wonderful to be able to have the discussion with you, Andy. So thank you for joining. So we're going to have, I've got a few questions for Andy, and then we're going to have a kind of practical exercise led by Andy in the middle. And then at the end, we'll have kind of a question and answer session from all of you guys joining on Zoom. Just to say, if you have comments throughout the webinar, we welcome you to post those in the chat box. If you have questions that come to your mind throughout the webinar, feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we'll come to them at the end. We do really want to have an interactive chat with you this evening, so we'll invite your participation at certain points as well. But without further ado, I'll welcome Andy again and maybe kick into our first question this evening. So when Andy and I were talking about and preparing for this webinar, we really talked about the concept of compassion and also the kind of feeling of shame and how that can be quite a overwhelming and controlling feeling and experience for those that are going through mental health difficulties, and that is something that that I think it's really important to acknowledge. And Andy has written on this topic and has shared from his own personal experiences on the topic of how to approach shame and how to deal with shame with compassion. But the first question really is, what impact can shame have on our mental health, Andy? And however you would like to approach that question.
Thanks so much, Flo. Thank you so much for your hospitality and your presence, and thanks so much to the Network of Wellbeing and friends that are here from Compassionate Mental Health and from Leeds and from elsewhere. It's really wonderful to be here. So I'm just conscious that as we enter the dialogue, I just want to say something around just inviting people to, take care of yourselves during this webinar and meet your own needs as much as you're able to, and use the opportunity to be in dialogue with us and share with us what's coming up. If shame was an easy subject to approach, we'd all be talking much more openly about it, wouldn't we? And depression and anxiety and some of the distress that we can feel was easy to speak about, then it would be much more part of the open way in which we meet and greet each other. Well, that's not been my experience. My experience of encountering very strong feelings of shame is that they've led me to certainly a feeling of quite radical disconnection at times, actually, and a feeling of being very much alone, unsafe, getting into very, very sort of low states, and feeling, my shame can give rise to the thought that people who love me would be better off without me. And it's a really upsetting thing to acknowledge and a hard thing to speak about. Because, you know, as I sit here now, I'm here in Norfolk with family in the next room, and it's lovely to be here with my nephew and his partner and Kirsty, my wife. And it's just really upsetting to think that I'd got into that state of mind. But I think that shame is the difference between guilt and shame, I think, is can be useful to sort of think a little bit about or unpack. So I think guilt is I've done something wrong, and shame is I am wrong. And I know that a lot of the work for the Compassionate Mind Foundation, Professor Paul Gilbert and many other friends and allies, the insight there is that shame is the number one block to compassion. So when we're experiencing shame, it can be very hard to retain our compassion for ourselves and the world around us. Well, certainly I think my experience has been that I've kind of run away from my own shame, left myself out of my world of compassion and just tried to pour compassion into other people, which is not really a healthy or sustainable position. So I'm really grateful to friends and allies at the Compassionate Mental Health Gathering, and particularly grateful to Malcolm Stern, who invited me to write about my relationship with shame and how I'd endeavoured to meet that shame more consciously with compassion. And then I think questions arise for me then around the notion of compassion as a practice. So how do we make compassion integral to the way we relate to ourselves and the world around us? So that certainly enabled me to, as I've put it before, kind of allow my shame up out of the basement to be met more fully, and then to begin to learn from it as I meet it with, I do what I can to meet it with a quiet mind and an open heart, and to include it along with all the other little I's that make up the big me. So it's work in progress, meeting shame with compassion, but it's certainly taught me to be patient. It's not really even a destination. It's just a continuing inquiry. It's taught me about tolerance. So to sort of tolerate some of these really aversive feelings, these really difficult feelings and states of mind, and to kind of in a subtle way turn towards them rather than run from them. So to allow myself space, that compassionate stance, if you like, is a spacious stance rather than kind of narrowing and perhaps meeting myself with contempt. Compassion enables me at this kind of space to open up. It's more, there's a kind of a gentle holding there. And then, there's certainly some other facets that have come in as well around forgiveness. Seems pretty fundamental to evolving my relationship to shame and love. So those are the sort of four things that have come up very directly as I've sought to meet my shame with compassion, and I guess then to move towards a more balanced way of being. So back to Paul Gilbert, he talks about these three flows of compassion. So self to self, self to other, and other to self. So this meeting of my shame with compassion has been very much a deep dive into the kind of the internal world and trying to open up space inside to come to terms with some of the things that believe about myself. You know, these are kind of core conditioning. It runs pretty deep, so it's quite deep work. But on occasions, I catch a glimpse that I'm already whole, and all of the little fragments, you know, they feel like they're all part of this self that sometimes feels like it comes together.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Andy, and thank you so much for your invitation to those joining us this evening to kind of take care of yourselves in this discussion. I think that, you know, we really wanted to shape this discussion as an open exploration of these topics, and we're aware. I actually meant to kind of touch on at the beginning, but I'll just touch on now. You know, mental health is a wide and catch-all term, and many people have different conditions that range from kind of mild depression to hearing voices or experiencing extreme states of mind. And this webinar is really for those who would like to learn and share more about compassionate ways to deal with kind of mental health and mental distress that comes up in ourselves and others. But if, you know, if this is, of course, we welcome a really open discussion, and we're going to be talking about approaches. Andy's going to share a kind of practical exercise that could be helpful. Although, of course, we do definitely say if you're experiencing extreme distress, then it's very important to kind of seek professional help. And I think touching on your response there, Andy, as well as professional help, it's also important to reach out to loved ones in your life and really know that you're not alone, that there are other people there for you. I know that one exercise I've done with shame that I found very powerful, shame and compassion, is just an eye contact exercise with one other person that was kind of guided as part of a group exercise, where we looked into each other's eyes and just realizing that actually the other person in front of you has also experienced shame and has also had those kind of darker feelings. And like you say, it can be difficult to make space to discuss those, and therefore people don't always know that that's something that we share as humans. That's, you know, and like I mentioned, of course, there's different degrees, and of course we need different degrees of help. But, you know, I think that sense of not being alone and reaching out for support is very important. And that kind of leads us in a way to our next question, which is, what would a more compassionate approach to mental health look, sound and feel like? This was a question that we shared on the kind of Facebook event in the lead up, and was the most popular question, with people wanting to kind of have a sense of what that looks like in practice, I suppose.
So I love what Meg Wheatley says. She says, whatever the question, the answer is community. So I think that's quite a good place to start. I think that compassionate mental health is accepting, it's non-stigmatizing, non-pathologizing. There's a way that I think that compassionate mental health is to do with creating safety, creating authentically safe spaces for people to be held and to be heard. Some of the work that we did at Frameworks for Change led us to get to know some families who'd very sadly lost some loved ones in a nursing home, and around that time these three principles emerged, which I'll share here in case they feel in service. I've shared these at the Compassionate Mental Health Gathering, so perhaps the future of compassionate mental health that's looks, sounds and feels compassionate, makes space for people to grow in their awareness. So that's the first principle. There's a growth of self-awareness. Second principle I've referred to already, the principle of the love of community. So these could be thought of as guiding principles. I wonder, you know, if we were to ask 100 people that are part of the mental health system, what are the principles that are guiding us? We probably get lots of different answers, and I'm not prescribing these principles, but just offering them in case they're helpful. So growth of self-awareness, love of community and harmony with nature. And I think there's something really fundamental about our humanity, our shared humanity. I think there's a way that we still tend to speak about mental distress through the lens of something different, something fundamentally. There's a kind of a way that perhaps we're meeting it with fear rather than love and compassion. And I think that, you know, the more time I've spent directly reflecting on aspects of the human condition, the more clear it becomes to me that this is part, you know, the what we're speaking about is a very sort of, it's part of the normal range of what it means to be human. It's hard being human. You know, from an evolutionary perspective, we're kind of quicker to threat and fear than we are to love and compassion. You know, we've got this amygdala, we jump back to the sort of ancient wiring, these big kind of animal feelings, this tricky old brain. And it's harder for us to kind of come into the neocortex and connect that with the heart and the gut and the whole sort of nervous system, which is where we can tolerate distress, actually, through quietening our mind and opening our heart, being more mindful, being more compassionate. So I think the future of mental health, it looks, sounds and feels more humane, more curious. So I think there's a sense of humble expertise. I think the way expertise is held is changing. It feels like there's a real shift happening, the trauma-informed care, and really thinking much more deeply about respecting the lived experience of the person who's perhaps coming into a system. And then certainly, you know, inspired by Russell Razak and others that are working through the open dialogue methodologies about really how do we hold expertise, and really, you know, this sense of deep humility. So there's a really lovely saying from Zen Buddhism, which is, try and get this one right. In the mind of the beginner, there are many possibilities, and in the mind of the expert, there are few. So I think it's that way that as we, there's a risk that those of us that work in mental health services can accumulate a series of kind of expert positions that may lead us to have what psychologists sometimes call narrow framing, which might lead us to quick judgments about what people might be living through, which then might create the conditions where there's no space for the meaning that the person themselves are making of their own experience. So I think there's something around compassionate mental health looks, sounds and feels like what has meaning for each of us, really, rather than having any sort of more generic construct. So it's evolving. You know, it's not to denigrate or say we don't need people with deep expertise. That's not what I'm driving at. But it is about saying that as we evolve, there's more of a sense of a shared space. So stories are being heard. So rather than, you know, what's the matter with you, it's what happened to you. It's that deep curiosity around what we've lived through and what meaning we've made of what we've lived through.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And if anyone would like to share, of course, any reflections on what Andy has shared so far, then feel free to type into the chat box, or if you've got specific questions that are coming up around what Andy has shared, then put them in the Q&A box and we'll come to them later. But yeah, I think there's that sense of, I'm not sure if tension is the right word, but I want to say slight tension between the formal system, which is, and the expertise, which is very much needed, but then that doesn't serve to kind of crowd out sense of like kind of meaning and experience from individuals that are going through mental distress, and that is a very delicate balance. And I do think what you say about community is really powerful. I mean, it's not directly related, but in a way, that sense of that care comes in many forms, and that, you know, that there's kind of a medicalized form of care, but there's also a holding form of care, and there's a need to make room for different forms of expertise and different forms of meaning within those spaces, and that can be really challenging. Obviously, I'm speaking as someone that works at the Network of Wellbeing. I don't work in mental health care services, and I imagine a lot of yourself, having worked in the NHS and on these issues, and a lot of people on the call have a lot more kind of direct experience of that. But would you, I mean, just to kind of check in with you, I guess, would you say that tension is the right word, or is it more kind of an opportunity, or how have you experienced that?
I think it's a healthy tension. I think it's a healthy tension flow, and a creative tension. And I think it's a tension that we really directly sit with at the Compassionate Mental Health gatherings, where there's very much a sense of space for people to share their own stories, and we're bringing together folks who are kind of helping us to evolve the paradigm, if you like. So I think it's a creative tension. I'm not sure, Susan, if you got your question answered. Perhaps I saw you asked a question. Did somebody else answer it? Russell Razak, from Open Dialogue, I see there's a few comments in the chat box, because Susan was asking about, you referred to a Russell, but Richard has helpfully included the link in the chat box, and the Compassionate Mental Health Gathering, which is kind of linked to from Bridget's link, and we will send around in the follow-up email, I think it sounds such a brilliant resource for people wanting to dive into this topic in more depth. So thank you for sharing the link, Bridget. And Angela has commented, maybe one practice is dropping our judgments and concepts of what we think mental health difficulties are. Which is a very good point. And Jenny has commented she's just starting out on this journey, and she'd like to ask Andy how long his journey has been so far, how long it's taken him to get to the place he is today. So since I've read that one out, I'll invite you to answer that now, Andy, and then if there are further questions, please do put them in the Q&A box, because we will have a section for your guys' questions at the end. Thanks, Jenny. I first went to the GP for depression in September 2016. Had a really, I don't share this with judgment, but in a way it's quite interesting and builds on some of the dialogue that we've been having here. The first experience with the GP was a really poor experience. It was a sort of archetypally generic, if come back in a month, if you're still feeling it, here is some information about antidepressants. And then the second appointment with the GP was just radically different, where the GP, and I didn't want to go back to the doctor, but I was becoming more unwell. I was finding it very difficult to function, and getting into quite scary states of mind and not feeling safe. And then I went to see the GP again, I think in December 2016, and he was wonderful. He was so conscious and asked me about my home life and who was there, and said, I'm really concerned about you. And that was a really important thing for me to hear, actually. It was that kind of humble expertise. He said, I want to see you every 3 days for the next month. And somehow he managed to do that. And at the end of every GP appointment, he'd always say, what else do we need to do? Which I just find really moving. Just that sense of the kind of we space. So moving from kind of illness to wellness, I think there's something very much about kind of co-creating our own wellness, which I guess is what the network of wellbeing is all about. But so Jenny, it's ongoing. I thank you for asking that question. I think I mean, for me, it's what's one of the things that's been fundamental for me is kind of finding a way of practice. So having some kind of daily disciplines that I come back to in terms of a mindfulness practice, and thinking about Russell Razak and what brought him to Open Dialogue. The way he shares that story is that he really came to Open Dialogue through mindfulness, through becoming aware that perhaps of his own judgments. Angela, to build on the point that you made about dropping our judgments. So that beginner's mind, that mindfulness, just to begin to notice my own judgments, and then to kind of open that space of curiosity again.
Yeah. Thank you, Andy. And I see there's lots of valuable comments being shared in the chat in relation to the thing that Deb has said. We are all on a journey, and we pick and learn things as we go along. I don't think we will ever reach the destination because it keeps changing and improving. Well, mine does. And I think, yeah, I can definitely relate to that, Debs. I think everyone is on a kind of ongoing process with a sense of mental well-being. And Bridget has helpfully shared the quote, the full quote that you said. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. Yeah, I think that's very powerful. And Jenny has said, thank you for sharing so much personal experience and speaking out. It's hugely powerful, Andy.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And in a sense, your kind of courage to share with us this evening, for me, links to a comment Lisa has shared, which I do definitely relate to, Lisa, that she said she finds it that there are so many disabling barriers, and my heart sinks when we have another Mental Health Awareness Day. It's so necessary to have them, but I can't help think that it's all about ignorance and makes me feel sad. So I think there is this sadness and frustration that there isn't more open discussion, and that it can be so challenging to talk about these topics openly. But that's why I'm feel very grateful to have this discussion with you, Andy, and to be part of these types of discussions where people are brave enough to share, and it just opens up a bit of space, and like you say, creates that sense of perhaps wider community where it's more possible to share the lows as well as the highs of life.
I think just on the topic of the heart sync and the awareness days, was that Lisa that said that?
Yeah, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, I really resonate with that. A friend of mine taught me about the difference between being a reactionary and an activist. And I think quite unconsciously, a lot of the work in the sort of campaigning space around mental health can still be quite reactionary and stigmatizing, and can be singling out, the 1 in 4. Well, actually, there's 4 in 4. Every person on the planet has a mental health story, and that mental health story is going to change and evolve. And for many of us, many of us, there's, distress is going to show up. That's part of the human predicament. That's part of the human story. It's also part of the human gift, It's kind of what makes us human and what's so profound about it. So the reactionary is kind of a sort of kicking against things. So might be trying to sort of change the system in some way. And the activist is just standing for something. And I think that's what we're doing here right now. I think we're standing for compassion, and we're standing for openness, and we're standing for equality, and we're standing for sharing our human stories with each other, which I think is kind of, when all's said and done, it's as good as it gets, really, is that you're being held and you're being heard, and you might, as a result of that experience, be healed. That's certainly been my experience. Whenever I feel like I'm being held by somebody non-judgmentally, there's a way that is a healing experience in some way. And when I'm struggling and people leap to judgment and maybe, lovingly give me advice or say, do this, don't do that, it always has the opposite effect. It can kind of trigger in me, I shouldn't have said that, or I should have, it makes me doubt myself. So yeah, let's collectively not underestimate the power of non-judgmental listening and really saying, help me understand. If I'm somebody that you feel safe to share your story with, then that would be a total privilege. So just saying, what's your story, and then what else, and all of the things that you shared, then what are the kind of threshold moments in your life? What are the sort of emotional touch points? What are the kind of pivotal moments? Just hearing each other's story.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Andy. And I think that what Lisa originally shared really resonated with a few people, that that to avoid that kind of approaching mental health in this kind of almost tick box or like surface level way, and so like making those spaces for deep non-judgmental listening is a part of being able to go deeper, you know, into the topic in a way that is more meaningful, hopefully. And I see there's lots of amazing comments being made, and it's really great to see the chat and discussion, and do feel free to interact with each other, which I see you're already doing as well. I'm aware that we wanted to do a kind of interactive exercise with you, and I almost wonder whether it's a good time to move on to that now, Andy, so that we give enough time at the end for everyone to share their questions and their comments. What do you think? How do you feel?
Let's do it.
Okay, great.
Let's do it.
So we usually around just before, to kind of absorb some of the discussion and what we've shared so far, and thank you so much to everyone that shared in the chat box. I'm sorry we haven't been able to read out every comment directly, but we really want to offer some kind of tools and offer a chance for you to ask Andy direct questions as well. So we're going to move on to a kind of practical exercise that Andy has found helpful in the past and wanted to share, and then we'll move on to the questions after that. So I will hand over to Andy to lead us in that.
Thanks so much, Flo. So pen and paper would be helpful if you've got one. If not to worry, but just kind of give people a moment to grab a pen and paper. So 4 questions that have helped me, and really sort of live on within me to some degree as a daily and a weekly practice. So I started thinking about these questions when I heard Kristen Neff and Chris Germer talking about the shift from the fight-flight position to the attend and befriend position. So I got thinking about, well, how would I embody that shift from fight-flight to attend and befriend? And then these questions emerged. And so I thought I would offer them here. So I'm just going to say the questions first, in case they're helpful for people on the webinar or people that are watching the recording to hear the questions. So the first question is, what am I holding on to? And I'm going to do a little embodiment thing in a minute. But the first question is, what am I holding on to? And the second question really sort of seems a bit obvious to follow it, but has helped me a lot, which is, what do I need to let go of? The third question is, what's mine to hold? And then there's a kind of supplementary question, which I always put in brackets, which is, and what's not? So what's mine to hold and what's not? So am I holding things that aren't mine? And then the fourth question is, what do I need? So what am I holding on to? What do I need to let go of? What's mine to hold? And what do I need? And this feels a bit weird because I can't see anybody, but I thought I'd just show you the moves just in case it's helpful. So I'm just going to step away from the laptop and unplug for a minute. So I know that Angela and Bridget and some people on the call are familiar with these moves. So this is the first move. So you sort of really come into, maybe your shoulders are up, you're really gripping tight. So this is the kind of holding on move. So what am I holding on to? And maybe just take a moment just to see what comes up, if anything. And kind of sometimes we just grip onto things like ideas or memories or judgments about ourselves or possessions, or it could be, what am I holding on to? Just getting a sense of that. And then we always take a deep breath between the moves. So take a nice deep breath in. So my hands are now sort of waist level. And I've just opened my hands and relaxed the front of my body. My knees are slightly bent. My shoulders are nice and relaxed. And I've just got a sense of just opening, just allowing space. So the question here is, what do I need to let go of? And you might actually, I don't know,
we all sort of experience the world differently, but sometimes there's a sort of feeling of almost like an energy when you're sort of letting go of things. And then the third move, another deep breath in. I've no idea if anyone's doing this with me, but never mind. The third move, come in. It's a bit like you're holding a tree or a beach ball. So watch for the shoulders going up, because that will move you out of that will move you out of an integral position. So the question here is, what's mine to hold? So you have a sense of really sinking down into the ground, really feeling your feet on the ground, almost feeling like there's roots coming out of your feet down into the ground. And this is what's mine to hold. And what I noticed straight away is that I'm in this position, so I am mine to hold. That's the most responsible position I can take, is holding myself. And then what else is mine to hold? And what's not? So this is the sort of, my wife and I, forgive me if this is a little bit crude, I hope this is okay, we call this the shit shield. Because so yeah, what am I kind of, I've lived a lot of my life like this, very out of balance, trying to hold too much, soaking up a lot of other people's stories, getting into empathic distress, taking on too much. So this is what's mine to hold. And the last move is, so hands together, and you bring your hands over your heart. And then the question here is, what do I need? And I don't know why, but my head always goes, I slightly bow with this one. It's just quite a humble position, which is just, what do I need? And what it sounds like in my mind now, it didn't used to sound like this, is, what do you need, mate? What do you need? What do you really need? So if I'm a bit off balance, or if I'm struggling in some way, as I still often do, I'll come into this really simple but quite radical question, I think, which is, what do you need? And this kind of friendly voice, Paul Gilbert of Compassionate Mind Foundation, finding this friendly inner voice, rather than saying, you've done it again, you've messed up, what have you done this time? Rather than sort of beating myself up, fight, flight, I'm coming into this, what do I need? Yeah, so maybe, you know, at times of difficulty and distress, what do I need? Thanks, Jenny. What do you love about it?
I love it too. Jenny commented that she loved it in the chat box, but it's virtual and touches all the senses. But is that virtual? No, visual.
Yeah.
Visual and touches all the senses. Yeah, I think there's something really about in like the embodied aspect of what you shared as well. And although I didn't do it just now, I'm happy that we're recording, because I was thinking I'm going to do this later myself. But I think that moving through like those different movements, it allows, you know, a kind of connection to into a connection with yourself that maybe gets lost when you get caught in the thinking mind. Takes you out of your head. Exactly, Jenny. That's what I was trying to say. And Lisa says, empathetic stress is a new term for me, but it makes total sense.
So yeah, I think I'm really glad this has come up, because I really wanted to say something more about the difference between empathic distress and compassion fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
So Joan Halifax is absolutely brilliant on this. She's written a book called Edge States, which is well worth a read. And she talks about altruism and respect and empathy, and these other states where there's like a really fine line you can easily tip into distress. And so I think that, and Matthew Ricard in his research on the difference between empathy and compassion is very important, and we're not going to have time to unpack that completely. But what seems to be coming through the neuroscience is that compassion fatigue is really a misnomer. What happens is we absorb too much of each other's distress and we enter each other's stories, and then the mirror neurons start firing, and then we get into kind of a sense of a shared co-created field of difficulty, rather than keeping that kind of what's mine to hold. And compassion is it's a motive. So there's two psychologists. Firstly, I witness that there's suffering, but then I'm moved to act. So that has its own energy. It's restorative and generative. So compassion is something that's much more sustainable. So having a more sophisticated understanding about the difference between empathy and compassion, I think will be really important as we continue to make progress. I hope that makes sense.
That makes total sense, and it's really helpful, because I think that often it's some, you know, that kind of system overwhelm that we experience. Some people call it compassion fatigue, but actually, like you say, that's not the deeper meaning of compassion. And if you are experiencing that sense of compassion, then you can also, from that compassion, take wise action, which gives a sense of moving through something rather than becoming overwhelmed by it, even if that action is small. A small reaching out, a small connection with another person that's also caring about the topic at hand, is very powerful. So thank you very much for sharing that. David has said he loves the visuals and he's going to use it. I think David earlier commented that he's working in a role as health, safety and wellbeing manager for a progressive social landlord. So he's found it really informative to hear some of the topics that have been brought up and the things you've shared, Andy. So thanks, David. That's great to know that it's been useful for you. So I wanted to give a bit of space for any questions that have arisen. Obviously, you guys have been amazing, like commenting and sharing your own experiences and reflections in the chat box. And there are a few questions in the Q&A box to run through. I just wanted to touch on, even though it's in the chat box, I wanted to touch on a question from Sarah first, because we were talking about the real importance of making space to listen non-judgmentally. And Sarah shared that they have at her work some mental first aiders, but that are there for that purpose but aren't used. And she asks, how can we help people to feel safe and comfortable to open up? I think that's a really good question, Sarah, and I wonder what you think, Andy.
Thanks, Sarah. I think creating the conditions in which people are open with each other is a fascinating question to do with culture and climate. Really, it's to do with what kind of values are we living out. You know, how clear are those sort of core values? What kind of workplaces do we want to inhabit, and how can we create? In a way, that's been a lot of the work of Frameworks for Change. So one of the things that we designed at Frameworks for Change is called a compassion circle. Lots of people now are getting into this kind of idea of these compassion pods as well, which can be a group of 3 or 4 that really have the intention to care for themselves and each other within a complex system. So there might be, you know, there's that real danger in any workplace of kind of getting lost in the crowd and feeling like you can't find that safe space. So I think one of the questions perhaps to think about is you know, how do people meet? What are the kind of some of the ways in which people meet? When I was a manager in the NHS, we had something called team time, where we'd meet in a very reflective way once a month, and we'd go around the circle and we'd check in, and you'd spend time with a partner and you'd appreciate each other. And those sort of practices have really stood the test of time. So I think questions of closed or open cultures, how do we create the conditions where people can be open with each other, are really systemic and structural. So what kind of liberating structures could you potentially think about that would create more favorable conditions for people to be open with each other? So there's this kind of notion of proximal compassion and distal compassion. So proximal compassion is proximal, what happens in the moment, and distal compassion is what can we do now that will create more favorable conditions for more proximal compassion moments to take place. So what are those sort of causes and conditions, if you like, of an open-hearted, humane culture?
Thanks, Andy. That's really, really helpful. And I'm just going to go to the questions in the Q&A box. We've just got about 10 minutes left of the webinar, so if anyone has any questions and you'd like to put them in the Q&A box for Andy, then please do, and we will try to answer at least a few of them. So Roger has asked, given the difficulty people find in accessing mental health services, 18-month waiting times, etc., how can we ourselves support people who need help?
Thanks, Roger. That's such an important question. I don't want to be glib in my answer. I think there's something around what's coming to mind to share is something that my wife said to me a few years ago when I was traveling a lot and doing a lot of quite sort of, when I look back on it, it would all become a little bit heroic, where I'd get a call and people say, can you come and help in this nursing home or in this inpatient unit where there were problems with culture? And Kirsty said, you've got really good at getting other people's houses in order. And she didn't need to go on to say that you're not really here, you're not really present here. So I think there's something around, I've thought about that a lot. It was really challenging. So getting your own house in order for me kind of makes me think about, myself, my household. So I think really, really connecting in with household, and then thinking about being a good neighbor and being part of a community. So there's really something about proximity and place that I think, circling back to the first question on this webinar, which is, what might the future look, sound and feel like? I do think being much more conscious around, if you like, the sociology of mental health, the sociology of co-creating, good collective well-being. So I think hosting at a local level, starting, sharing circles, community suppers, a lot of the things that Network of Wellbeing are doing in Totnes, which is totally inspiring. But I think it's, without moving out of balance with my own flow of compassion for myself, then what potentially small things can I do as an activist? And part of that is about just being very awake to what's already happening in the community. Because in every community, there's always, people who have this kind of impulse to make it better. So aligning with those people and finding out what they're already doing and just getting your ear to the ground and talking to people and listening. And then finding where the flow is for you, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. That's really valuable. And I think creating those spaces, it's again, like you were saying in response to Sarah's question about having those structures in place so that you have the possibility to keep deeply connect with someone or check in if they're maybe responding a bit differently or feeling a bit low to how they usually would be. And I think having those kind of enabling structures in place makes a massive difference. So I just to sort of build on that a little bit in case it's helpful. I had an incredible experience in the valleys in South Wales. I got invited to something called a food co-op, and the source energy of this food co-op was about bringing people together, and it was about sort of nutrition and well-being, and it was for folks that were having a really tough time on lots of levels. And I spent the morning there with Angela, actually, that's on this webinar as well. We just had an incredible time, and it was a co-created space. There was a big urn, teapots. There was some little baskets with some fruit or some veg for £2 that people could get. There were people giving each other hand massages. There were some people doing some art. There were a couple of people that kept the kind of earphones on because they didn't necessarily want to talk, but they could just come. And so I thought that was a wonderful model. There we go, Bridget sharing it with us. Yeah, the GoVal food co-op, really inspiring. Brilliant. And it's amazing to have all of the resources and models that have been shared both by Andy and also by you guys in the chat during this webinar discussion. What we'd really love to do, see this as a part of a larger discussion. And of course, Andy is involved in a lot of other kind of projects and events. So I wanted to give an opportunity in closing to for Andy to just introduce a few of those so that you guys can kind of stay in touch and find out more and go deeper into this topic if you would like to. And just to say that we will send around links to the things that Andy mentions, and I'll try and copy as many of the links that you guys have shared in the chat as well in the follow-up email so that you've got those resources available. But Andy, would you like to share a bit about upcoming events and activities?
Sure. So really excited at the prospect of the next Compassionate Mental Health Gathering, which is in a beautiful place called Broughton Hall from the 27th to the 29th of November. And just come, basically. It's not a retreat, it's not a conference, it's a gathering. And it's always a really wonderful coming together of people that return and come back. There's often family members that come along together. There are folks that are coming at things very much from the sort of professional side of things. There's always extraordinary speakers, space to share our stories, wonderful food. There's a really lovely wellbeing centre there as well at Broughton Hall, so it's going to be a wonderful experience. So we can share the links with you, and you'll have seen the logo, the Compassionate Mental Health logo. So we're really grateful to Bridget for aligning with us on this webinar. And then, yeah, really looking forward to being with Josh and Angela and other friends and allies in Leeds on the 6th of December for an Exploring Common Ground event. Thanks, Angela. There's the Compassionate Mental Health link. So yeah, we're really building into one of the, if you like, the structures. Back to your point, Sarah, the potential structure is a festival. Why not have a place-based festival of compassion and well-being, and see all the kind of community magic that gets weaved and all the conversations that need to happen to create such a reality. So there are dates set for a festival of compassion and well-being in Leeds in 2020, and we've had compassionate city suppers, and we've had various events, and then there's an event on the 6th of December called Exploring Common Ground, which we're really excited about, which will be lots of space for people to connect and share their stories. You know, where's the energy, what's building and growing, and then from a Frameworks for Change perspective, you know, if I can help and serve in any way in terms of sharing perhaps a vision for compassionate places, if any of the sort of structures resonate with you around perhaps compassion circles or compassion pods, I'd love to help people kind of reframe the way they think about meetings and leadership. So if I can help in any way, then please feel free to be in touch.
Thanks so much, Andy. And yeah, I see that the Compassionate Mental Health event link has been shared in the chat, and we'll include that in the follow-up email. And Bridget has shared the link to the Facebook group page for the Compassion and Wellbeing Festival in Leeds, and like has been mentioned, there's an event coming up on the 6th of December that's open, so we'll include the link to that. Just before we close, a few final kind of practical questions from people. Ella has asked, is there a website with links to compassion circles in other cities, for example Birmingham? Would love such spaces in life. Happy for this to be included in the follow-up email. So I don't know whether that's got a quick answer, Andy, or whether that's something we can chat about afterwards and include the information for Ella and others in the follow-up email.
Frameworks for Change is a good place to come, Ella, to connect with us around your dreams around compassion circles, and we've been doing lots in Birmingham for the last couple of years, so let's connect.
Lovely. Great, and we'll include the Frameworks for Change website link, Ella, in the follow-up email, but you find it easily by Googling Frameworks for Change as well. And David Chard has just said, please provide details if you're available to speak at our Employers Wellbeing Forum. So I'll pass that on, I'll copy that so that Andy has those details and can follow up with you, David, if he's able to. Thank you very much. Thanks, Bridget, you've been amazing with sharing links, and you've put the Frameworks for Change link in there directly. So thank you so much. And thank you all so much for being such amazingly active participants, and for really being so warm-hearted and sharing. And Andy, thank you so much for having the courage and authenticity to share your own experiences in a way that I know for me makes a lot of space for others to feel more comfortable in themselves and feel more comfortable sharing their own experiences. So that really, I think that makes a huge difference in the world, and I just want to say thank you so much for that.
I'm really moved, Flo, by the way you've held the space, and your care and attentiveness has really created these conditions. So thank you so much, and thanks so much to everybody that's participated, and let's take care of ourselves and each other. Yeah, lovely. Okay, brilliant. Thank you guys all so much for your lovely chat messages saying thank you, and we will sign off now and send around the recording so that you can all enjoy watching this again or sharing it with friends if you would like to. Goodbye.